How concerned was God about the health of millions of nomadic Israelites camping in the wilderness? Are we spiritually clean through Christ? Let's look at Leviticus 13. In the Bible, were the terms clean and unclean also applied to diseases? The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "If anyone has a swelling or a rash or discolored skin that might develop into a serious skin disease, that person must be brought to Aaron, the priest, or to one of his sons. The priest will examine the affected area of the skin. If the hair in the affected area has turned white, and the problem appears to be more than skin deep, it's a serious skin disease, and the priest who examines it must pronounce the person ceremonially unclean." How long was quarantine to be? What if after quarantine the rash has not spread? If the bright spot is white in the skin of his body, and its appearance isn't deeper than the skin, and its hair hasn't turned white, then the priest shall isolate the infected person for 7 days. The priest shall examine him on the 7th day. Behold, if in his eyes the plague is arrested, and the plague hasn't spread in the skin, then the priest shall isolate him for 7 more days. The priest shall examine him again on the 7th day. Behold, if the plague has faded, and the plague hasn't spread in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. It's a scab. He shall wash his clothes and be clean. What if after quarantine the rash has continued to spread? But if the rash continues to spread over the skin after they appeared before the priest for purification, they must again show themselves to the priest. If the priest sees that the rash has spread over the skin, the priest will declare the person unclean. It's a case of skin disease. How is the priest to examine any such skin disease, broadly termed leprosy? Any of you with a skin disease must be brought to a priest. If he discovers that the sore spot is white with pus and that the hair around it has also turned white, he'll say this is leprosy or a skin disease. You're unclean and must stay away from everyone else. But if the disease has run its course and only the scars remain, he'll say you're clean. If the sores come back and turn white again, he'll say this is leprosy or a skin disease. You're unclean. However, if the sores heal and only white spots remain, the priest will say, "You're now clean." What details was the priest to look for to pronounce the person unclean? If there's in the skin of one's body a boil, and it heals, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a reddish white spot, then it'll be shown to the priest. And the priest will look, and if it appears deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It's a case of leprous or skin disease that has broken out in the boil. What details was the priest to look for to pronounce the person clean? But when the priest examines it, if there's no white hair in it, and if it's not beneath the skin but is faded, the priest must quarantine him 7 days. If it spreads further on the skin, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It's an infection. But if the spot remains where it is and doesn't spread, it's only the scar from the boil. The priest is to pronounce him clean. What about burn scars? Could they become infected? When a person has a burn scar in the skin that turns bright, white reddish or white, if the priest examines it, and indeed the hair has turned white, with a white spot appearing more extensive than skin deep, it's an infectious skin disease with a burn scar that has spread. The priest is to declare him unclean. It's an infectious skin disease. But if the priest examines it and discovers that there's no bright area or white hair, or if he discovers that it's not more extensive than skin deep and it's dull, then the priest is to isolate him for 7 days. What were the guidelines if the burn scar was to spread? And the priest shall look upon him the 7th day, and if it be spread much abroad in the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It's the plague of leprosy, a skin disease. And if the bright spot stay in his place, and doesn't spread in the skin, but it be somewhat dark, it's a rising of the burning, and the priest shall pronounce him clean, for it's an inflammation of the burning. What were the guidelines if there was an infection on the head? Now if a man or woman has an infection on the head or on the beard, then the priest shall look at the infection, and if it appears to be deeper than the skin, and there's thin yellowish hair in it, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It's a scale, it's leprosy, or a skin disease on the head or of the beard. But if the priest look at the infection of the scale, and behold it appears to be no deeper than the skin, and there's no black hair in it, then the priest shall isolate the person with the scaly infection for 7 days. After a week's quarantine period, how is the priest to judge the infection anywhere on the head? And on the 7th day the priest shall look at the infection, and if the scale has not spread, and no yellowish hair has grown in it, and the appearance of the scale is no deeper than the skin, then he shall shave himself, but he shall not shave the scale. And the priest shall isolate the person with the scale for 7 more days. Then on the 7th day the priest shall look at the scale, and if the scale has not spread in the skin, and it appears to be no deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes, and be clean. What if the sore on the head spreads after it was pronounced clean? But if the sore does spread in the skin after they are pronounced clean, the priest is to examine them, and if he finds that the sore has spread in the skin, he doesn't need to look for yellow hair. They are unclean. If, however, the sore is unchanged, so far as the priest can see, and if black hair has grown in it, the affected person is healed. They're clean, and the priest shall pronounce them clean. When a man or woman has white spots on the skin, the priest is to examine them, and if the spots are dull white, it's a harmless rash that has broken out on the skin. They're clean. What was the priest to do about examining head sores? As for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he's bald, but he's clean. He whose hair has fallen from his forehead, he's bald on the forehead, but he's clean. And if there is on the bald head or bald forehead a reddish-white sore, it's leprosy or a skin disease breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine it, and indeed if the swelling of the sore is reddish-white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, as the appearance of leprosy or a skin disease on the skin of the body, he's a leprous man. He's unclean. The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His sore is on his head. Was there to be a quarantine for those with a serious skin disease? Those who suffer from a serious skin disease must tear their clothing and leave their hair uncombed. They must cover their mouth and call out, "Unclean, unclean," as long as the serious disease lasts. They'll be ceremonially unclean. They must live in isolation in their place outside the camp. What was the priest to do about any article of clothing worn by a person with a skin disease? The garment also that the plague of leprosy or skin disease is in, whether it's a woolen garment or a linen garment, whether it's in the warp or the woof, of linen or of wool, whether in a leather or in anything made of leather, if the plague is greenish or reddish in the garment, or in the leather, or in the warp, or in the woof, or in anything made of leather, it's the plague of leprosy, and shall be shown to the priest. The priest shall examine the plague, and isolate the plague 7 days. What was the priest to do with such an item of clothing after examination? On the 7th day he'll examine the infection again. If the infection has spread in the clothing, the weaving, or the skin, whatever it's used for, the infection is a case of infectious skin disease. The item's unclean. The priest will burn the clothing, the weaving of the wool or linen, or whatever skin item in which the infection was found, because it's an infectious skin disease. It must be burned with fire. What must the priest do after a week if the mildew has spread? If the priest discovers that the mildew hasn't spread, he'll tell you to wash the clothing or leather and put it aside for another 7 days, after which he'll examine it again. If the spot hasn't spread, but is still greenish or reddish, the clothing or leather is unclean and must be burned. But if the spot has faded after being washed, he'll tear away the spot. When was such clothing to be washed rather than burned? Then if it appears again in the garment, in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, it's spreading. You shall burn with fire whatever has the disease. But the garment, or the warp or the woof, or any article made of skin from which the disease departs when you've washed it, shall then be washed a second time and be clean. This is the law for a case of leprous disease, or a skin disease, in a garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or the woof, or in any article made of skin, to determine whether it's clean or unclean. Was Jesus concerned with spiritual uncleanness? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you're like whitened sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. Are fornication and fraud kinds of spiritual uncleanness? Have we been called to live holy lives? Abstain from fornication. No man go beyond and defraud his brother in any matter, because that the Lord is the avenger of all such, as we also have forewarned you and testified. For God has not called us to uncleanness, but to holiness. How concerned was God about the health of millions of nomadic Israelites camping in the wilderness? Are we spiritually clean through Christ? You decide.